Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Radio Who podcast on whowhatwhy.org. I am your host, Guillermo Jimenez. Before there was a war on terror, there was a war on drugs. It is the longest-running war in America's history. It has caused just as much damage, destruction, and loss of life as any traditional war. The drug war in Mexico has reached unprecedented levels of violence. The U.S. government's involvement in Mexico's drug war now mirrors its involvement in the war on terror in the Middle East and other parts of the world. The consequences of these interventions have been disastrous, both for ordinary people abroad in places like Mexico, Iraq, and Afghanistan, as well as here at home. Police militarization, the prison industrial complex, mass surveillance, the loss of privacy, the institutionalization of torture. For 40 years and counting, the drug war has been the pretext for these threats to our civil liberties. My guest today, Rebecca Gordon, teaches philosophy at the University of San Francisco. She's the author of the book Mainstreaming Torture, Ethical Approaches in the Post-9/11 United States. She's also a regular contributor to TomDispatch.com, and her latest article is titled, Can You Say Blowback in Spanish? The Failed War on Drugs in Mexico and the United States. Rebecca, thank you so much for joining me. How are you doing today?
I'm doing just great. I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah, it's great to talk to you again. The last time that we spoke, we talked about your book, and we talked about the U.S. government's use of torture on detainees, on alleged terrorist suspects, and the way that torture has been institutionalized. And we'll touch on that a bit here again because it does relate to what we're talking about. But what I'd like to focus on primarily is this article that you've written recently for TomDispatch.com. And Tom has also added an additional headline up top, says, it didn't work in Afghanistan, so let's do it in Mexico. And,
exactly.
Yeah, I think it actually might be a bit of the reverse, actually, if we look at it sort of chronologically, but nevertheless, it holds true. So before we go any further with the details and the various issues that you raise in this piece, can you talk a little bit about why you wrote this and what your interest is in the U.S.-Mexico drug war? Why is this important to you?
Okay, there are a couple of reasons. First of all, I have friends who live in Mexico. Mm-hmm. Some are Mexicans, some are Honduran, but they're folks who've been in Mexico for a very long time. And I can see that the results of policies that begin in the United States are making their lives extremely difficult. My friend who lives in Mexico City but travels to Cuernavaca on the weekends, she says neither she nor any of her friends will drive at night anymore in Mexico. You just can't. It's not safe. But beyond that, I live in San Francisco, and I see every day the results of the drug wars in my own city. I see it when the police especially target Latino young people. For example, just a year ago, there was a young man named Alex Nieto, you may have heard about him, who was shot on Bernal Heights near my house because he was holding a burrito, and somebody thought that that was a dangerous weapon. And I see the gang surveillance cameras on the corners of my own street, and I know that the drugs and the drug wars are deeply affecting the communities of African Americans and of Latinos in this country as well as in Mexico. So I'm concerned because this is my home, and I see 2.3 million people in jails and prisons in the United States today, vastly disproportionately young people of color, and almost, the vast majority of them are in jail for something to do in some way related to the laws against the use of drugs. And I think that the Mexican war is a big mistake, and our involvement in it is bad for Mexico and bad for the U.S.
Indeed. I can definitely relate to that on a personal level. I may have mentioned this to you the first time we talked, but I did grow up along the Texas-Mexico border, and I saw a lot of this firsthand, of course. And it must have been right around 2006 or 2007 when my family and I decided, we're not traveling to Mexico anymore. We're not going to go. And it was, but prior to that, it was very, very common. The border was fairly porous in a way where folks that lived along the border could travel freely to and from the sister cities, so to speak, the border towns. You travel back and forth. It was like no big deal. And then shortly after 2007, when things really, really ramped up, it became it was no longer worth it to even try. It's just it became so bad, and it continues to be very, very bad. Of course, if you've been following the headlines, you know that it's just been the violence has been just terrible. But so definitely I can relate to that from a personal perspective. And reading this article through it a little bit, I can tell that you tackle this issue the very same way that I do, and the way that I tackle most foreign policy issues, which is asking myself, just what the hell is my government doing here, and what are they really up to? And so let's get into that a little bit. What are they up to? What have you found in preparing this article, or just in your reading of events in the past, that has either surprised you or that you think people ought to know about as far as the U.S. government's role in Mexico and in this drug war?
Absolutely. So I think that to sort of set the stage, it's helpful to know that the drug war as a real war, it was already in process when the first PAN, or National Action Party, President Vicente Fox took power, but it really took off under Calderon. Under Felipe Calderon, who took power as president in 2006. And a lot of people have some questions about the legitimacy of that election, but that's another question. But at that time, the United States signed on to what was called the Mérida Initiative, named after the town where it was signed, which was basically a secret agreement between Mexico and the United States that the U.S. would provide up to $2.4 billion in military aid to help Mexico militarize their war on drugs. And so one of the things that PAN, which is the right-wing party in Mexico, began to do was to take the rather poorly organized federal police force, which was long known to be a corrupt police force, and really turn it into a military force. And so to arm it. And at the height of the number of men in arms, they had up to 50,000 people in arms, armed with automatic weapons, with helicopters, with all of the armaments of a regular war. And they went to war against the cartels. And the cartels at the same time went to war against the Mexican government at the same time that they were also deeply infiltrated with the Mexican government. So the U.S. is providing the money and the armaments, and there's actually, just by accident, I didn't even know this was happening, a friend of mine brought out an article the same day specifically about the Mexican military's buying binge. And it's by John Lindsay Poland, and you can find it at NACLA.org. That's the National Committee on Latin America. And so the author is John Lindsay Poland, and it's a very detailed study of exactly what kinds of U.S. arms the Pentagon, the Mexican army has bought from the United States. So basically, this is how it works. You and I pay taxes. The U.S. government gives that money to Mexico. Mexico turns around and takes that money and uses it to buy weapons that are manufactured in the United States so that U.S. arms corporations get rich. Basically, it's a transfer of billions of dollars from us to the arms companies by way of the murder of upwards of 100,000 people in Mexico. But the U.S. went beyond Plan Mérida. And they also made much more secret agreements with the Mexican government that, unlike Plan Mérida, which the Congress signed off on in Mexico, these were secret agreements in which the U.S. was permitted to come into Mexico and to operate by making alliances with some of the cartels to get them to give information about the other cartels. So they called it divide and conquer. And the idea especially was that they kind of pushed up and propped up the Sinaloa cartel against the cartels, the other cartels, especially the Juarez cartel in Ciudad Juarez, and some of the other main cartels. And so the result was that at the same time that we were supposedly fighting this drug war, we were also allowing members of the cartel we were working with to continue bringing drugs into the United States. The DEA even went so far, that's our Drug Enforcement Administration, or Drug Enforcement Agency went as far as to give multiple reentry visas to some of their confidential informants, which allowed them to go back and forth across the Mexican border and bring in thousands of pounds of drugs when they would also come to meet with their contacts in the DEA. So the U.S. has been involved in a really ugly and dirty way in some ways really continuing the war, because none of this strategy has actually worked.
Indeed. No, so much to digest there that you've mentioned so far, but it does boil down to, I think you come back to the same point a couple of times, which is, or we both, I think anyone would, when you study this, is the money involved. All those billions of dollars. And not just in the trade itself, which people know about by now. I think the UN estimates it's a $300 billion industry, just the trade in itself. But beyond that, there's a whole nother market, which I guess I like to call, but I'm sure I'm not the only one, the drug war market itself, which is fighting the war, is a billion-dollar industry, as you pointed out just now. In fact, I just saw an article not too long ago. I brought this up in the last podcast we did, and it's a Business Wire article that really caught my attention, and I'll just read this briefly. It's global homeland security market to be propelled by rising cyber threats to $364 billion by 2020. But if you read this a little further, it's not just the cyber threats they're talking about. They list terrorist threats, illegal immigration, drug and human trafficking as the reasons why this market is booming. And so there's a vested interest, of course, as you mentioned, in keeping this war going. And so with that in mind, let me ask you this, because I planned on bringing this up a little bit later, but now that it's come up, why not talk about it?
Sure, go for it.
So let me sort of backtrack a bit and sort of frame this in the proper way. So you mentioned the Merida Initiative, right? People call that Plan Mexico because they compare it to Plan Colombia during the Clinton administration. So we have now we have Plan Central America, the Northern Triangle Alliance for Prosperity. And so it's like they never learn, these people, right? Or do they? And that's the question. This is the question I come back to so often. Blowback or by design? Well, unintended consequence or purposeful malfeasance? And so that's the big question that I keep coming back to. And so I want to ask you that. So given these relationships that we know about, you mentioned the DEA working with the Sinaloa cartel. I would add to that the CIA's documented relationship with the Guadalajara cartel, which is sort of the predecessor of Sinaloa. So given all that we know, what do you think is really going on here? Is there more to this than simply blowback?
That is a really difficult question to answer. And part of me says it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether it's intentional or not, because it should be stopped either way. But I think that, and this was a question I had to ask when I was writing the book about torture too, in terms of the release of information about torture. If it actually helps the people in power for the rest of the country to know that torture is going on, because it reminds us that we should be scared and only the government can protect us. Did they do it on purpose? Did they release the information on purpose? And I think the answer is probably sometimes yes, sometimes no. I think that very often when elites, like any other human being, discover that something works for them, they keep on doing it. So if the drug wars are working for them, if it's continuing to bring money into the big arms contractors, if it's continuing to bring money into what some people call the prison industrial complex, then why not? And let me mention that it's not just the big arms dealers, although that's a big part of it. So it's not just the folks who sell the Black Hawk, Sikorsky that sells the Black Hawk helicopters. It's also the people who make assault rifles and anti-personnel weapons, grenades, those kinds of things. There are 6,700 gun shops along the U.S.-Mexico border. Do you know how many legal gun stores there are in Mexico?
Zero. One. I was going to say zero.
One.
Was my guess.
There's exactly one in Mexico City. And that's the only legal place to buy a gun in Mexico. It's legal to own a gun in Mexico, but the only legal place to buy one is in Mexico City. So all these other guns, they are getting in across the U.S. border. And that brings us actually to one of the U.S. involvements we didn't mention, which was this Operation Fast and Furious. So this was a scandal when it broke in 2010 because a U.S. border guard was actually killed with one of these drugs. So what the DEA decided was, we know that drugs that are being bought in these 6,700 gun shops on the border are being used by the cartels. We know they're being brought into Mexico. Let's do this. Let's let these suspicious purchases go forward. And then, without telling the whole Mexican government, we will keep our eyes on them and see if they lead us to the leaders of the cartels by following the guns.
Yeah.
This is called gun walking. The problem is they never followed the guns. They just said, okay, fine, let them go across the border. We won't interdict them. And nothing else happened except that these guns turned up over and over again as the weapons in murders committed both in the United States and in Mexico. And they care. So when we say people, maybe what we really mean is comfortable white people, to be perfectly blunt.
Right. Middle America, the interior
Middle
of the
America.
country. Right.
So why should they care? Well, Mexico is right on the border, first of all. Secondly, as I said, can you say blowback in Spanish? This is all coming back to bite us. It's making our cities and the possibilities for our young people in those cities really, really difficult. And not only in our cities, people who live in rural Maine and in rural Vermont, and I have friends up there, should care, because suddenly there is a huge influx of heroin into rural parts of the northeastern United States. We used to think of heroin when I was growing up as a problem of the inner city. And today it's a rural problem, and it's coming through Mexico. Now, a lot of it may be grown in Afghanistan, but they're starting to cultivate it in Mexico. And so if you care about your community and you don't want to see your young people go to jail for these crimes or end up getting hooked on a drug that they can't kick, you should care. If you care where your tax dollars go, do you really want to be having money siphoned out of your pocket and directly into Lockheed Martin and Sikorsky so that the Mexican government can line their pockets and buy weapons from U.S. arms manufacturers? Maybe not. I think there's a lot of reason to care. And of course, the other reason that I think we should care is that, just as in the United States, here in Mexico, those are human beings. Those are people like us.
Very good point. Yeah, that's what it boils down to. Absolutely. In closing, anything else you'd like to mention, either about your article specifically or just generally about the issues we've been talking about? And before we go, please do mention, of course, where folks out there can find your work online.
Oh, excellent. So if you want to find my work online, it's at mainstreamingtorture.org. And there's a blog there which has links to a lot of the articles I've posted and also to some of the podcasts that I've done. I think there's a link to the last one that we did. The name of the book is Mainstreaming Torture. And I think really all I want to say is thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk about something that really matters to me and to the people in this country.
Absolutely, yeah. I really want to thank you also for your interest in this, for talking about this, writing about this, the work that you're doing, and for taking the time to talk to me today and sharing your ideas with our audience here today. I really do appreciate that very, very much. And I want to thank the audience out there for tuning in and for listening. Be sure and join us next time here on the Radio Who podcast on whowhatwhy.com. Thank you all for listening.